For anyone who has ever swooned, laughed, or cried during a rom-com, you're in good company. And when you're under the weather, like I am right now, there's nothing quite like cozying up with one. A great rom-com is chicken soup for the heart. The best of the genre brings a hope and optimism that everything's going to be okay, even when the ending takes the bitter with the sweet. Whether you're a romantic or a skeptic, grab a sweet treat and prepare to fall in love all over again with the rom com. Welcome to Classic Movie Club. I'm your host, Chad Kinnerk, the digital editor of Film Review. We've been celebrating cinema here at Film Review since 1944. A lot of our former Film Review contributors were queens and kings of the rom com, from Audrey Hepburn to Cary Grant, Doris Day to Clark Gable. That's just a few of the actors that made their mark on the genre. In Falling in Love at the Movies, rom-coms from the Screwball Era to today, a new volume from Turner Classic Movies, author and entertainment journalist Esther Zuckerman explores how the beloved genre has shaped cultural narratives and captured hearts at the box office. Zuckerman highlights the enduring charm of iconic films like Roman Holiday, which features on the cover, from the golden age of 1930s screwball comedies like It Happened One Night to the rom-com boom of the 80s and 90s, Zuckerman explores how these films have not only provided us with comfort and joy, but also shaped our understanding of love, relationships, and even fashion. The book delves into the work of key auteurs like Preston Sturges, uncovering how filmmakers have both upheld and challenged the traditional romantic comedy tropes. Zuckerman is an entertainment journalist whose work has appeared in publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, the Hollywood Reporter, and many more. She's the author of Beyond the Best Dressed and A Field Guide to Internet Boyfriends. And today, she joins us to talk about the rom-com.
With all genres, in order to understand the present, you also have to have an awareness of what came before and its significance. And the book really explores those influences rather than looking at rom-coms in a linear sense. You're looking at them almost in a cyclical sense, how they're evolving over time.
Yeah, for sure. That was totally my idea when I was trying to figure out how I wanted to structure the book because the assignment was pretty vague. TCM was interested in a book on rom-coms, and I'd worked with Running Press before, so it was really open-ended and I could sort of do whatever I wanted. And thinking about sort of linking the past to the present was a big way I figured out, like, I guess not just how to structure it, but like how to make the writing and the analysis interesting. Because I didn't want it to be just a sort of guided tour, from A to Z.
A lot of genres in general are challenging to define, like where are those parameters at? How do you sum up the rom-com?
This is like sounds so sort of basic, but like it has to have romance and it has to have comedy. And the romance has to be a major part of it. I think that's where sometimes like those lines get blurry because I think when you get into like the 2000s, I think sometimes movies get like glommed on with rom-coms because they fell into that, and I hate this term, but like the chick flick designator.
Mm.
So like stuff like, The Devil Wears Prada, for instance, I think some people call a rom-com, but like it's not, because like it's like not about romance at all. Like, yeah, there's some romantic interests, but it's about work. Like it has to have like, so I think for me, or even like, I mean, if you go further back, like some of the quote unquote like women's pictures, something like The Women is like an example. Like it's funny and it's about women, but it's not about romance, So
Right.
like that's the, really unscientific delineation that I sort of tried to come up with. And it has to be funny. Like humor has to be sort of the guiding force behind it. It has to have like funny scenarios, which gets referenced in Sleepless Up. But something like An Affair to Remember, it's not a rom-com. Like it's drama, So that's sort of where I felt.
And rom-coms always get such a bad rap.
Yeah.
They're called fluff. Why do you think that is?
I mean, on the basic level, it's because like women like them, and like women's entertainment has been like largely devalued in
Mm.
popular culture. But I also think it's partially because when the genre became like oversaturated in the sort of early 2000s, and you were seeing sort of, I guess, cheap imitators of the best one, and that's sort of when the rom-com started to die in popular culture. So you sort of see that there are rom-coms that are fluff, and those were like the not as good ones, but they sort of took over pop culture for a while.
I think of it as, and I think you mentioned this in the book, like cinematic comfort food and how
Yeah.
comfort food is doesn't mean it's bad food, right? That can be
Yeah,
really good food.
exactly.
Just like comfort food, you can have your frozen version, or you can have the version that grandma made that is
Yeah,
this,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, and I think that's part of it is people see like stuff that makes you feel good as being sort of lesser, which I don't think
Mm-hmm.
is true.
Yeah. What's been the most exciting part of this project for you?
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously there were like many phases to it. Sometimes the research is always exciting. It's always fun to like dig through archives. Like I went to the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy. Stuff like that is really like fun on a nerdy level. One of the exciting things like post release of the book has been I've gotten to like show and introduce a lot of movies at like screenings and stuff, and getting to see stuff that either I haven't seen on the big screen forever, or like
Mhm.
honestly I've never seen on the big screens. I introduced a screening of the Philadelphia Story, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, even before I wrote this book, at the Paris in New York on 35 millimeter. And
Yeah, man, you can't beat that.
like that was a great experience. I just did an event in LA where I introduced broadcast news at the Los Feliz 3, and like getting to see that movie, and like that was like a sold out screening, and like getting to see that movie, another one of my favorite flop sweat scene like in a crowd full of people laughing, was like really like moving and memorable. So that was really, in the release of it, that's been really lovely and exciting.
That's one of my favorite things when you get to see a classic film that obviously we weren't around for when it
Yeah.
originally came out theatrically, and to get to experience that with an audience because we love these films. We get to watch them at home, maybe with family, with friends, but it's a
Yeah.
different experience when you're in a theater of, largely strangers celebrating this film, this experience together.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
What's been the most challenging about this project?
Figuring out the structure was really challenging, like figuring out how to make those links, but also make it like entertaining and fun for the reader. Like, sort of that balance between like celebration and analysis was like challenging and really fascinating.
And you dive into a lot of the different elements of the rom-com. I think one for me that's always fascinating is location and how location transports the audience, affects the story. I'm thinking of a film like Roman Holiday.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, it is really, I think one of the things that I miss from movies, and like also a lot of like, if you look at classic film, as I know like there's sort of two versions of like the classic film location. Like there's the beautiful like Hollywood soundstage, which is something that like I do miss, and like as well. And then there's like movies actually shot on location. Stuff like Roman Holiday is like a perfect example. A Foreign Affair, the Billy Wilder film, is like a really incredible example. Because it uses like footage of Berlin, like post World War II. And I think like one thing that I miss sometimes in modern movies is when it's just like, oh yeah, that's like Vancouver, but like standing in for New York, or like that's like Toronto or Atlanta. The places where tax breaks are good. I think location, like the real feel of a place, is so important. But I think location also extends to like time period and like the mood. So like something like My Man Godfrey being like a movie about like the depression, like and feeling that.
There's also a lot of mistaken identity, but one of the themes with, for instance, Roman Holiday is that sort of deception that comes into a lot of
Yeah.
rom-coms. Why do you think some of these tropes continued throughout the rom-com genre? Is it a way to create more of an underlying conflict with characters that are falling in love? What are your thoughts?
It's just a really good trope. You don't know who you're falling in love with, and then you you fall in love with them anyway is just like sort of, unbeatable as a trope. And obviously, I think it can be done. I write about in the book, like, I think it can be done well. And I think can be done well and it can be done poorly. And I think you can sometimes see where when it's done poorly, it feels icky. Like it feels,
Yeah.
oh, like these people don't actually like each other that much, or, and sometimes, like, even in terms of some of the older ones through our modern lens, it can feel a little like the question of consent comes in.
Right.
I love like the Doris Day Rock Hudson movies, but you look at the endings of, something like Pillow Talk, where he's like physically carrying her like to his house, and you're just like, after like having lied to her the entire movie, and you're like, ugh. I think it works best when there's like a case of mutual deception, which is why like something like Roman Holiday works so well, because it's like she's lying to him about being a princess and he's lying to her about being a journalist. And yes, there's a little bit of a power imbalance because he knows that she's a princess, but she doesn't know that he's a journalist. But they're more on an even playing field because they're both sort of trying like running away from who they truly are. And that's like what makes that good. Or if you have a film that like, from later that like really wrestles with the deception, something like Tootsie, where like,
Mm.
you see the fallout of it, is like, I think helpful.
There's a quote in the book about Paris, France versus Paris, Paramount.
Yeah, it's a Lubitsch quote that actually like Nancy Myers was going to use for the title of her movie, which isn't getting made right now, which is sad.
Oh, that's so sad. Through this book, what were some of the films you were most excited to share and talk about?
Like my all-time favorites, stuff like, Roman Holiday, it's on the cover, like stuff like Philadelphia Stories, Moonstruck, Broadcast News, like those are all my like absolute like favorite movies of all time. But it was also fun to sort of fill in some holes I was missing, and then write about those. I really sort of found myself, taken with Jean Arthur, who I like hadn't spent a lot of time
Mm.
with before, especially in the rom-com mode. And like I love the film The More the Merrier, the George Stevens film, which I think is like also a really sort of politically interesting film. I love the Mitchell Leeson film Easy Living with her. So, stuff like, again, like I hadn't seen Claudine, which is like a great film from the 70s, like a black rom-com with Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones. So it was really fun to sort of share both like the movies that I love, and like the movies that like were newer to me.
Hmm. And you mentioned Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant and loving that pairing and the spark between
Yeah.
them. Do you have a favorite out of their four rom-coms that they did
I
together?
mean, I can't, Philadelphia Story is my favorite. That is the one that I've loved the longest. I mean, I love Bringing Up Baby too, but that's my favorite.
In talking about this book, do you feel like there are certain films that come up more in conversation than others?
It's funny we haven't talked about When Harry Met Sally yet, like in this
Yeah.
conversation. That's one that always comes up. The Nora Ephron movies always come up. Those probably definitely come up like the most, just because they do feel like this sort of spark moment.
Where is the future of the rom-com? Where is it heading?
It's a weird one. I think you've obviously, the rom-com's been called, I write about this in the conclusion. The rom-com's been called dead like plenty of times over cinema history. It's never really been fully killed. And I think right now we're in a weird period where frankly it's really hard for a lot of stuff to make it into theater
Yes.
if you're not like a major tentpole movie. The mid-budget trend over the past couple of years has like lent itself towards horror over like rom-com, because there was sort of for a while like a proven like, yeah, people come out for that communal experience of like seeing a horror movie in theaters, whereas there was like a feeling of, well, people just want to watch a rom-com on their couch. But I think the interesting thing is like there've been these markers throughout the years that have proven that that's not always the case. Something like Crazy Rich Asians obviously being like a huge example, though that was in 2018. Like shockingly, like almost a decade ago.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
but even more recently, something like Anyone But You sort of opened quietly and then like gained a lot of like power through word of mouth, like honestly TikTok, like and then became one of the highest grossing movie like rom-coms in recent memory. There is an audience for them, and I think you're seeing a trend back to movie stars like wanting to make them a little bit like someone like Glenn Powell, starring in Anyone But You, also making Hitman, like not signing up for like a superhero franchise that's gonna like take up all his time. I think you're seeing some of that swing back, but I think you just need the studios to sort of like sign on and like realize that they are good business. I don't have a crystal ball, but I have hope.
And while we do have hope that new classic rom-coms are still to come, there's nothing like seeing a tried and true classic back on the big screen. And a place where you can do just that is the Triplex Cinema in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. A nonprofit organization reopened the cinema in 2023, dedicated to providing a space where the Berkshire's community can find all kinds of movies, including the classics. Let's bring Triplex creative director Ben Elliott into the conversation to discuss recent screenings of classics like Roman Holiday and how curated repertory programming of classics can bring communities together.
Ben, tell me a little bit more about Triplex, your mission, and your work as the creative director there.
The Triplex, the theater itself has been in Great Barrington, out in far in western Massachusetts, will be its 30th anniversary next year. The original owner decided that he didn't want to keep operating it and ended up closing it. It was a community effort to basically come together to save the theater.
That's
And
awesome.
we formed a nonprofit as a way to not only save the theater, but make sure that the community had a voice in what programming at the theater would look like.
Mm-hmm.
We really wanted it to be a space for the community to come together. And that's given us an opportunity to really kind of do some really interesting programming that in the previous model the theater wasn't able to do. In addition to programming first runs and indies and restorations, we are able to do rep screenings and series, and we just kind of completed our first run of things of special events in 2025. It's been a great month. We kicked off 2 series, retrospective of films from 1975 celebrating their 50th anniversary. They'll be running all year. It's just some one-offs of stuff like Roman Holiday, Harold and Maude. Got incredible reception from our audience. There's just such an appetite, I think, to kind of come together and watch these classic films together. So having the space to do that as part of our mission has been really one of the most amazing things about reopening this theater.
This episode, we're talking all about the rom-com. You said the reception's been great. What has some of that feedback been like?
Yeah, there's a rhythm to seeing a movie with an audience that you don't get at home. You kind of discover where the big laughs come, and that will always kind of vary audience to audience too. So every screening will be a little different and have a different texture to it. But yeah, I mean, these are Harold and Maude and Roman Holiday are 2 of my all-time favorites that I've outside of screenings at like college, I've never really seen in a theater, and especially in our current world, as well as in New England in February with the weather that we are famous for, having opportunities to come together with your community. The fact that we sold out our screening for Roman Holiday, which is a movie
That's awesome.
that's over 70 years old by this point.
Right.
And it's something that people were like, I just wanted to feel happy. This movie is just kind of a form of cinematic happiness, and it's not saccharine, right? It's a very incredibly well-made movie that has one of, I think, the most famously bittersweet endings that kind of set the template for romantic comedies and comedies of romance to come. But it was just, a lot of people just had never had the chance to see it on a big screen. I loved getting to watch people watch it. I loved getting to see a restoration that has Dalton Trumbo's credit back where it rightfully deserves to be.
Yeah.
It was just really, it's cool. And it's cool to be able to kind of bring people together. And every time we book one of these things, it's always an experiment. Don't know until we start selling tickets if people are going to show up. But to see this kind of reaction just shows that there is still a love for this kind of classic cinema out there, and that people want to experience it together, because it's different than watching it on TV. You know, we did a screening of like A Face of the Crowd back in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people came to that were like, this is one of my favorite movies, and I've never had the chance to see it on the big screen. And so just being able to offer that to people is something that we really love to do.
You know, cinemas are often the heartthrob of the community. It's a place for people to get together, to share.
It's a weird thing sometimes to think of this act of sitting in a dark room, watching something together, and not necessarily interacting with the fellow audience members in the moment, but you are, and you're kind of, it's a way of finding your people. You know, I love cinema as a way of building community. I've been incredibly lucky to have amazing experiences living in New York and Chicago at theaters, you know, like the Music Box and Nighthawk and Film Forum. The hope with this project is kind of to bring that culture out into smaller markets, into a rural community like the Southern Berkshires, because I think people who life has taken them away from a large city still want that kind of experience. And, you know, all the work that we've done so far show that they can be sustainable. The content of these films, even these older classic films, still are incredibly relevant today. So just to show that these films are still very much in conversation with the present, and that's a big part of the programming mission. I really hope we can do, and what I try to do with a lot of our programming and writing around the films that we show, is the way that filmmakers today are kind of in conversation with film history. My hope is always that if you see a movie, it inspires you to see another movie.
Hopefully you've been inspired by our conversations this month to seek out repertory programming in your area, and encouraged to revisit some of your favorite rom-coms. Beyond all the great films mentioned in Esther's book, there's a treasure trove of titles out there to discover from the Golden Age. It's a topic, like all matters of the heart, that resonates with all of us. That's our show. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a member of Classic Movie Club. Your support helps us produce a new episode each month and continue the legacy of film review. Don't forget to subscribe, like, review, and share the podcast with all your film friends. My thanks again to Esther Zuckerman and Triplex Cinema's Ben Elliott. You can find more details about Esther's book, Falling in Love at the Movies, Rom-Coms from the Screwball Era to Today, and the Triplex Cinema in our show notes. We invite you back next month for another adventure, but until then, here's looking at you, kid.